Hey guys, we're going to talk about the work and leisure chapter. And so, right out of the gate, you can kind of see the slide about how in the US, teens are spending a lot less time on homework on average as opposed to our Asian counterparts and their kind of peers in China and in India and so forth. So, what that relates to is having a little bit more free time, unstructured time, and sometimes, again, if it's not structured in a manner that is productive, sometimes that can lend itself to behavior that's less than ideal. So, like more time to drink, get into trouble, engage in more risky behaviors, that kind of thing. And I think there's a fine balance. I'm not necessarily suggesting that it's a great thing for teenagers to have 5 hours of homework upon getting home. Because of all the other things that they do. And I think a balance is actually a good move. But there's also a lot of free time to be, engaged with social media, to be engaged on the computer, to be playing video games and things that aren't so productive. So it's, because of this time that teenagers are a little bit more freed up, I think it's choosing wisely what they tend to do. There's a really good documentary called 2 Million Minutes that looks at, it's basically 2 million minutes, I think is a correct number. They're looking at, it's a documentary that there's actually 2 million minutes in like a high school, 4 years of high school. And so they looked at two teenagers, a male and a female from India, two from China, and then two from the United States. Actually, it's in Indiana, I'm sorry. And what they kind of looked at was just how different they spend their time, how they spend their time so differently, how many more hours that they're spending on their homework and, music lessons and things like that to make themselves really competitive. You'll see in that documentary how many of those students are going in for tutoring that's not required. And, if you think about a country like India where there's so much poverty, their kids can't rely on their parents to be their sense of support and such, and there's such a competition to excel through education because that's really their ticket out of poverty. There's a lot more, I guess, at stake for studying, so they're a lot more motivated. They grow up a little bit faster than we do in the U.S., so it's kind of interesting if you have an interest in kind of high school in different kind of countries. It's certainly worth looking at. So let's see, I'll kind of go through. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. And again, kind of being bored 25% of the time. So how do they structure that time? Our babysitter always says, if you are a person who is not boring, cannot be bored. If you're bored, that's your fault. So, school is boring to them. We also have to find a way though to make it more engaging. I mean, there were certainly times, even though I don't feel that I am a boring person, I certainly was less than inspired in certain high school classes. So I think it's our job as teachers to kind of keep students engaged and active in class. And you can also see that there are some trends as a function of which type of media outlet they prefer, and there's some age-related kind of typicalities. So they're more inclined, basically what ends up happening is something like TV, while that has kind of a lot of negative connotations, we don't like kids to be watching a lot of screen time, it is a little bit more social than something like listening to music with the headphones on, not engaging with anyone else. Sometimes TV can at least be a more communal activity. And I just have an example of kind of aggression, TV, violent TV, and the relationship between violent shows and such. And what this kind of take home is that kids who are most aggressive at baseline, maybe who are more attracted to that, are more likely to be negatively impacted by violent TV. So my daughter, who's not exceptionally violent except with her brother, hi Dad, my dad's in the background, just made a cameo. While she's not inherently violent, I mean, I could probably put her in front of the TV, for a couple hours a day and watch violent shows, which I wouldn't do. I don't think it's going to make her inherently violent. Now my son, who makes a gun and pew, pew noises out of everything, if I let him watch a lot of violent TV, I think that would have a much more negative impact on him. So it's kind of a both thing. You can't always just blame the TV, not that those are a great thing. And certainly video games are more negative because of the amount of engagement that you're involved in. So when you're actually playing, you're actually killing a police officer, you're getting reinforced for doing that. That's a more direct engagement as opposed to just watching something on TV that's more indirect. So, and in general, it's just not a great idea for students to have a lot of screen time. It's associated with things like, it's negatively correlated with good physical health, with, being, it's associated with having like higher amount of weight gain because you're just sitting there, you're not active, that kind of thing. And it's kind of abysmal how much time teens are spending reading. It's kind of a sad statement. It's also interesting to think about, like with respect to TV, how many TVs there are at home. What are the regulations in terms of kind of the rules of TV in your home? Are you sitting in front of the TV while you're eating? Or does a kid have their own TV in their room? Are there parental safeguards on what they can watch? I think some of those types of things make a big difference. And when a lot of kids are more technologically savvy than their parents, they're able to evade a lot of these safety precautions that parents have up with respect to the TV, what kinds of shows they can watch, and the internet and other things. So I use you guys to keep me up to date on all of the latest technology with things, so I am smarter than my kids. There's also a sense of relationship between media usage and ethnicity, actually. So we've kind of learned from the family chapter, minorities are more likely to be in single parent homes, so there's just less supervision. So if I were able to, as a kid, just sit down and watch TV for 8 hours a day and eat, chocolate and bonbons, I probably would have. But because my parents eventually came home, at 5 or 6, then after that I wasn't allowed to just unlimitedly, have access to TV and things like that. So that can make a difference. And also because perhaps they don't have as much money or resources for extracurricular activities. Extracurriculars cost money. They require transportation to get there. So that's another reason why there's a relationship between that and socioeconomic status. Sorry, just looking at some other things. And so there's lots of different reasons that kids and people watch TV. I certainly sometimes enjoy that to wind down. I think there are some benefits. My primary reason would be diversion, just to relax, escape, sometimes for educational purposes. I'm a documentary, I enjoy watching a lot of documentaries. But one thing that's interesting and to consider is teens are much more solitary in their media usage now with things like Netflix on their phone. They're not watching it in conjunction with sitting with the family. And so at a time when they're really easily influenced by things like the media, different singers and rappers and whatever, parents aren't having as much control or awareness of what their kids are watching or listening to. And then these things are really influential in terms of integrating this into the type of who is my identity, who do I want to emulate as a superstar or something. And so there's, again, a lot of independence at a time when teens are developing their sense of self and who they want to be. And so a lot of these things, like a lot of the shows that teens watch are discussing things like sex and drug use and relationships, and so having someone to process those things with would be beneficial. But oftentimes they're really not done in a communal setting. So you can also see some of the trends, like a lot of TV shows are featuring things like violence, featuring things like drug and alcohol use. Even Disney movies have more drinking than you would imagine. And so, it's just kind of paying attention to some of those issues are important, and sexual behaviors. And so often things like, romantic relationships and sexuality, they're never really addressing the less sexy part, like, getting birth control or STDs or anything like that. And if so, it's done in a way that's not super realistic. And so it's kind of sending a message to kids that, sex is just carefree fun, everybody does this, and you have to kind of check that with adults or other people and saying, like, this is not, what is the expectation of you, and so forth. I love this slide. Sex on the internet, 75% of teens inadvertently found pornographic content. Is kind of funny. So yeah, that's certainly obviously affecting teen sexuality. So this unlimited access to pornography online makes a tremendous impact on sexual arousal, sexual satisfaction, what is expected sexual behavior. So again, having those conversations, we can't turn a blind eye and assume that your 14-year-old kid has never seen pornography. That's just not likely. So I want to get quickly to the idea of employment. And this is where I get a lot of pushback, I feel like, from my students, like when I teach this class live. A lot of you have worked. I worked as a teenager, but I just want to challenge you. I think a lot of people see that, wow, it really teaches responsibility. Working is a great thing. I kind of want to warn you that there's not as good of data to support that, especially for kind of the most common teen jobs, and I'll kind of explain why. So in the U.S., that's a pretty common part of the norm. So about 75% of teens are working in the U.S., as opposed to like even in Europe, they're just not working as much. There's not as many jobs. There's not as many like Walmarts and Giant Eagles that are open 24 hours a day, or it's just not as conducive to working over there, how like their culture is and how our culture is. Mostly in Europe and, again, more like China, in Asian countries and things like that, they tend to work when it's required for the family, financially. And so sometimes there's actually a stigma associated with that. Like, wow, your family's poor, you're working, that kind of thing. It's more stigmatizing rather than the cultural norm to work. But what I would say, and again, other countries like Germany especially has a lot of really great internships, externships, clerkships, apprenticeships that are really beneficial and are trying to train them and help train their students to engage in the skills that they're likely to use that are congruent with what they're learning in college or what they want to do in higher education. And these are not typically the jobs that that we're seeing in the U.S. Like working at an ice cream store is not typically going to be teaching you similar skill sets that you're going to be learning and wanting to utilize in college. There's certain jobs for you guys who are interested in education, so working at like a day camp, something that's relevant, maybe doing tutoring, those kinds of things are really much more valuable. So my take-home message is that the jobs in the U.S. have a lot of inherent issues. So if I'm going to let my kids work, or if I'm going to encourage my students to work who are teenagers, or even my college students, frankly, to work, I'd want it to be something really meaningful. So a lot of jobs, typically, other workers are teenagers too. A lot of the customers are teenagers, so they're not getting good mentorship. You need, an extracurricular activity is a lot better. Typically, if you have a good coach or a mentor, that person can be a good source of information, support, assistance to you. Sometimes if you just have your buddy who's like 6 months older than you as your supervisor, you're not learning much. I think the biggest thing is that it's really not consistent developmentally with what teenagers are going through cognitively. You guys are learning in school, teenagers are learning in school things like physics, advanced chemistry, calculus, and they're like doing really basic, working on a cash register or something, right? At some of these jobs. And so there's not getting a lot of independent decision making. They're not getting great supervision. The skills that they're learning in school aren't used on the job. And sometimes it's really boring and repetitive, and they get a really bad taste in their mouth with respect to what work is. Like, wow, work is so boring and rote, and it kind of makes them engage in like not the best behaviors. You're not teaching them some good skills that you'd like them to maintain. Also, a lot of people cite financial reasons as such a benefit for working, but actually without good structure, there's a phenomenon called premature affluence. So again, most kids in the U.S. aren't working to support their family. The outcomes are much better when you are. So for that kid who's working to help his family, or maybe a kid who lives in a rough neighborhood, working is a better outcome than just kind of staying home or engaging in some disruptive or behavioral issues, around their neighborhood. But there's a phenomenon called premature affluence, which basically states, hey, kids have all this disposable income that they're not using to contribute to their family. Having more money contributes to them spending it on things like maybe unnecessary shoe purchases, clothing purchases, drugs and alcohol, having this disposable income. And that kind of sets a tone for, wow, I can just buy whatever I want when I want. I would still say I felt the richest I ever was when I had a job in high school. I didn't have any expenses really, or very minimal. And I had all this extra, a couple $100s a week to just do what I wanted. And so again, if you're going to invest that and take out minimal amounts of money and maybe use it to pay your insurance, that's great. So just really keep that in mind. There's a lot of negatives associated with working. Give them a job if you insist on them working. That's really meaningful. Working more than 20 hours is especially negative. So that's kind of what I would say. There's a lot of associated negatives, like increased aggression, misconduct, precocious sexual activity, delinquency associated with working. You start to disengage from school. You're tired. Sleep is not unlimited. So yeah, so that's my 2 cents on this chapter, and it's something that I feel really important about. So